Hello, today we are talking about carbohydrates and sugars as part of the Eat Well, Be Well nutrition series for University of Washington Center for Weight Loss and Metabolic Surgery. And this is Vanessa Imus, dietitian. So the objectives we're going to go through for carbohydrates is to learn why carbohydrates are needed in our diet, identify sources of carbohydrates, learn the difference between whole grains and refined grains, be able to calculate your carbohydrate needs, understand how limiting carbohydrates can help with weight loss, create a meal plan to meet your daily carbohydrate needs, and then put it all into action by setting clear goals. And similar for sugars, we're going to identify sources of added sugars, know your daily sugar limit, understand how limiting sugar can help with weight loss, know how to find added sugars on food labels and compare products, and put a plan into action by setting clear goals at the end of the session. So what are carbohydrates? These are the sugars, starches, and fibers that are found in foods. The healthiest options are going to be your whole grains, your vegetables, your fruits, and your legumes like beans or lentils. And these are the healthiest options because they contain vitamins, they contain minerals, fiber, and other phytonutrients. If you look at a food label, you'll see carbohydrates. Underneath the carbohydrates total, you will see the amount of sugars that are contained within those carbohydrates and the amount of fiber contained within those carbohydrates. The less healthy options are going to be more of your processed foods, white breads, pastries, sodas, sugar-rich foods. These contain very little nutrients and typically contribute to weight gain and increase the risk for diabetes, heart disease, and other chronic illnesses. So when we're talking about a whole grain versus a refined grain, this picture is a great illustration. You can see on the left with the whole grain, it's going to have this outer bran layer, which is the brown part, and that's what's filled with fiber and B vitamins and different minerals. The inside is called the endosperm. This is what you get when you have a refined grain. You only get this without the bran and without the germ. And this is just the starchy carbohydrate middle layer that has a little bit of proteins and a little bit of vitamins. And then in the whole grain, you also get the germ, which is the core that's packed with B vitamins, vitamin E, phytochemicals, and healthy fats. So a good illustration too in real life would be thinking of a whole grain like brown rice versus white rice. So the white rice is stripped of that outer bran layer and it's left with just the starch component. So you're missing a lot of the nutrient value. Here's a list of whole grains. I think a lot of times when we think of whole grains, we think of only a couple things like the brown rice, maybe quinoa, but there's a whole bunch of different varieties of whole grains out there. I encourage people to go to their local grocery store. A lot of times if you can use their bulk bins, then you can pick up a variety of whole grains and grab a cup of this, a cup of that, and they typically have cooking instructions on the bin so you can try different things, different types of whole grains. So why do we need carbohydrates? We need carbohydrates to provide energy and as a source of stored energy. Glycogen, which is carbohydrate stored in the muscle, is really helpful for when we run out of energy. Then we are going to break down that muscle storage of carbohydrates. We need it to sustain muscle mass. If we're taking in carbohydrates, then that helps to spare the use of proteins for energy. If we have a diet with very little to no carbohydrates, our body will start to break down muscle mass to get energy from the proteins that are stored. Also, certain vitamins for certain minerals, certain phytonutrients are available in carbohydrate-rich foods. And then the biggest component is going to be the fiber, which is really important for digestive health. We also need carbohydrates for brain function. We utilize glucose for our brain to work. And now moving on to how lowering carbohydrates will help with weight loss. So it's great to find a balance of getting enough and not too much. So usually helps to reduce overall calorie intake. A lot of times excess calories are coming from carbohydrate-rich foods. It helps to keep blood sugar more stable. the less carbohydrates that we're taking in, the less release of insulin that we need. Insulin usually tells our body to store those carbohydrates as fat. Lowering our carbohydrates is going to help to encourage eating a variety of foods that will help keep us full longer. If we have a lot of carbohydrates, it may limit our intake of proteins or healthy fats that help us stay full a little bit longer. So how many carbohydrates are recommended? So here in the blue box, this is where you can figure out your needs, and I'll walk you through this. But if you're able to take time right now to fill it out, write on a piece of paper if you don't already have these numbers. If you need your calorie goals, you can always talk to either your dietitian or your doctor to get your calorie goals so that you can figure out how many carbohydrates you need per day. So here's an example with using our recommended goal of 45% of your calories coming from carbohydrates. So how many carbohydrates does that equate to? So if we were advised to be on a 1,600 calorie a day diet, we would multiply that number by 0.45, which would be 45% of your calories in carbs. So that leaves us 720 calories worth of carbs. But most people don't know what 720 calories worth of carbs is. So that's why we do that final step, divide by 4. There are 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. And so this is going to tell us for a 1,600 calorie a day diet, we need about 180 grams of carbohydrate. And we're going to get the most benefit from getting those carbohydrates spread throughout the day. So 180 grams of carbohydrate may sound like a lot, but as we go through this PowerPoint, you'll see how it can add up pretty quickly. So how do I meet my needs? Again, distribute these throughout the day. That's going to help to stabilize blood sugar throughout the day. So if we take that total number, again, go into that purple box to do the calculations, your total grams of carbs, and multiply that by 0.25 or divide by 4. And that's going to give you the number of grams of carbohydrate per meal. The reason we divide by 4 is assuming you're going to have 3 meals, and then that fourth number, we would divide that further into 2 snacks or 1 to 3 snacks, depending on how many you are having in a day. So typically this is going to be somewhere between 30 to 60 grams of carbs per meal. The lower your calorie goal is, you're going to be closer to 30 grams. The higher your calorie goal is, you're going to be closer to the 60 grams per meal. And this is kind of your top limit. Carbohydrates are not something that you can save up for the day and use them all at once because it's going to produce a big spike in blood sugar, which is a lot more difficult to burn through those calories or burn through those carbohydrates as energy if you're getting them going into your system all at once. So we want to get that spread throughout the day for the biggest weight loss benefit and to feel satisfied throughout the day. So what does that look like? There's another term you might hear, which is carb choices or carb servings. And this table shows you what is a carb serving. And people use this interchangeably, as you'll see in the next slide. So grams of carbs, so 15 grams of carbs is equivalent to 1 carb choice or 1 serving of carbohydrates. So if your goal was 30 grams of carbs in a meal, that's going to be 2 servings of carbs or 2 carb choices per meal, as you can see here. And if it was 60, then your maximum carb limit for that meal would be 4 carb choices. And this will make more sense as we go through the next few slides. So here you can see on the food label where to find the carbohydrate content. First, you're going to want to go up to see what the serving size is. This one is 11 chips of baked Lay's. And here we can see the 11 chips contains 23 grams of carbohydrate. If we're talking carbohydrate choices, that's going to be between 1 and 2 carb choices, maybe 1.5 carb choices. So that's one way to find that information. And then on these slides, it'll talk you through what the serving sizes are for different portions of carbohydrates. And for those of you that are using the calorie trackers, the MyFitnessPal, the Verytastic, whatever it might be, you're going to get those numbers of carbohydrate within your tracker. So that's going to be the easiest way to keep track. So what foods contain carbohydrates? We break them up into 3 main sections, fruit being 1, vegetables, The starchy vegetables are going to be higher in carbohydrates versus the low starch vegetables. And then you've got your whole section of like grains, beans, other starches, breads. So when we're talking about starchy vegetables, each of these bullet points here is 15 grams of carbs, or one carb serving, one carb choice. So if you were limited to 2 carb choices or 30 grams of carbs per meal, you could choose 2 of these bullet points at that meal. So I could have 1 cup of carrots and I could have a half a cup of corn, and I would be at my max carb limit. So everything else on my plate would need to be low to no carbs, which would be more your protein, your fats, or your low starch vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower, asparagus, lettuce. Grains, beans, and other starches are also going to count. And here you can see each of these bullet points as well is going to be 15 grams of carbs or 1 serving. So if I wanted to have 1 cup of cooked carrots, I could also have maybe a slice of bread with my meal. And then again, if I was limited to the 30 grams of carbs, everything else would need to be low to 0 grams of carbohydrate. So here's some examples. You can see bagel is kind of a surprising one. 1/3 of a bagel is going to be 1 carb choice, which is the same amount of carbs as an average slice of sandwich bread. Again, if you have food labels, use the numbers on the back of the food labels, because you could find some thin sliced bread or light bread that may be lower, 10 grams of carbs, or some really hearty bread that may be 20 grams of carbs. So it will vary a little bit, but on average, that's what you're going to get, about 15 grams of carbs. 1/3 cup of rice when it's cooked, that is going to be 1 serving or 15 grams of carbs. 1/2 cup of pasta, 1/2 cup of oatmeal. Cereal, it's going to vary by how much sugar content, because again, sugar counts as carbohydrates. Same with granola. You can see that adds up pretty quick. 1/4 cup of granola is equivalent to 1/2 cup cooked oatmeal in terms of the carbohydrate content. And then you've got beans or lentils. So if I wanted pasta with dinner, I could have, maybe a cup of pasta if my limit was 30 grams. And then I wouldn't be able to do the garlic bread, or I wouldn't be able to do a starchy vegetable. Everything else would have to be the protein. So nothing is completely off limits. It's just finding a balance of how it all works together. Here you can see some of the more snacky foods. 5 saltines is going to be 1 serving. 1.5 graham crackers, that's not much for 1 serving of carbohydrates. 1.5 Oreos. A tablespoon of syrup, jam, honey, that's going to be 1 carb serving. And then milk also. Milk I just threw in this category. It has lactose, which is milk sugar, and so that's also going to contain carbohydrates. And then the next section is fruits. That's a big source of carbohydrates for people as well. So again, each of these bullet points, 1 carb choice, which is 15 grams of carbs. Not that you're limited to that, but that gives you the portion size. So a small apple or orange is one serving of carbs. If you get one of those gigantic apples or gigantic oranges, you may be more like 25 to 30 grams of carbs. 1 cup of most berries is going to be about the same. And then you can see it adds up pretty quick if you're doing something like dried fruit. So 2 tablespoons of raisins, carbohydrate-wise, is equivalent to 1 full cup of grapes. So that can add up really quick. Juices, 4 ounces is already going to be your 1 carbohydrate choice or your 1 serving. And it's not going to be as filling. I'd recommend going for more of these whole fruits, which are going to have the fiber and the nutrients in it with the carbohydrates. So here's an example. 2 cups spaghetti noodles with 1/2 cup of tomato sauce, 2 slices of garlic bread, and 16 ounces of milk. So based on the information I just gave you, think in your mind or write down a guess you have for how many grams of carbohydrates this type of meal might contain. So take a minute to think about it. So if we add it up, 2 cups of the spaghetti noodles is about 86 grams of carbs. And you may be thinking of this in carb choices or grams of carbs. Either one works. A half a cup of tomato sauce is 8 grams of carbs. 2 slices of bread is 45 grams of carbs, which right there is 3 servings, 3 carb choices. And then that milk for 16 ounces is about 24 grams of carbs. So your total for this meal is going to be 163. And I could guarantee that nobody's goal is 160 grams of carbohydrate at one meal. So you have to make some modifications here. Here's some ideas on making modifications. Same sort of meal, but swapping out the noodles for something like spaghetti squash with the same portion, 2 cups, half a cup of tomato sauce, throwing in some broccoli, cutting it down to 1 slice of garlic bread, and then swapping out the milk for water. So take a minute to think about how many carbohydrates this might contain. And some of you may have some good guesses. Here's the breakdown. 2 cups of the spaghetti squash is 20 grams of carbs. And remember, our spaghetti here was 86. So that's a huge difference. We've got that tomato sauce, 8 grams of carbs. We've got the broccoli, which is only 3 grams for a full cup. So it's great to add these filling low carbohydrate rich foods so that you don't feel like you're missing out volume-wise. You're still getting the same volume of food. You're just getting lower carbohydrate containing foods. And then 1 slice of garlic bread may only be the 22 grams, and then the water isn't going to have any. So your total here is 53. And that, again, is compared to 163. So that's a big difference. So making modifications to your meals as you're keeping in mind how much carbohydrates they contain is going to be really helpful. And here's one more example. Breakfast oatmeal can be a common breakfast idea. 1 cup of oatmeal, 1 tablespoon of brown sugar, a couple tablespoons raisins, a banana on the side, and maybe 8 ounces, a full cup of orange juice. So think about how many carbohydrates this might contain. So here's your breakdown. The oatmeal, 1 cup of cooked oatmeal. Remember, half a cup on our slide previously was 1 serving, 1 bullet point, which is about 15 grams. So 1 full cup would be double that. So about 27 grams, almost 30 grams. If we add in the brown sugar, we've got 12 grams of carbs. If we add in a couple tablespoons of raisins, we've got 15 grams of carbs, or 1 more carb choice, and a large banana and the orange juice. So that total is going to be 112 grams of carbohydrates. So that oatmeal can be a difficult one depending on what you're adding to it. Here's some ideas for modifications. So 3/4 a cup of oatmeal. So it is a little bit less than this was 1 full cup of cooked oatmeal. Adding some chopped walnuts, 1 cup of berries, having a boiled egg on the side, and then swapping that juice for some water. So think about how many grams of carbohydrate this might contain. Here we've got just cutting down the portion a little bit of the oatmeal. Gives us 20 grams of carbs instead of that full cup, which was 30 or close to 30. We've got a 1/4 cup of chopped walnuts, which is only 4 grams. But it's going to add some flavor and texture, some healthy fats and protein to help you be full longer. 1 cup of berries. That's going to give you 20 grams of carbs. And then the boiled egg, again, adding that protein piece. If you haven't already taken the protein class, we talk a little bit more about that in detail, but having that protein is going to help you stay full longer and balance out your blood sugar better throughout the day. So your total here is 44. So you're having a good portion of oatmeal, you're throwing in some healthy fats, some protein, some berries, and having the egg on the side. You got 44 grams of carbs compared to the 112 here. And it's likely you're going to feel satisfied longer off a meal like this than the previous one because carbohydrates break down much more quickly on their own. Versus if you've got the protein or the healthy fats added, it's going to take a lot longer to break down, so it's going to keep you full a bit longer. So think back to your morning meal or what you had or are going to have for lunch or what you're having for dinner and how you may need to make modifications to be within that carbohydrate goal that you calculated for yourself. So just take a minute to reflect on that and maybe jot down notes. I need to do a smaller portion of cereal, or I need to check the label on my cereal box to see how many grams of carbs are in there. I should add in eggs, whatever it is that may help you to keep those carbohydrates within the per meal budget. And here are some examples of typical days to meet your carbohydrate needs. And you can see one side we've got 1,500 calories a day if that is your recommended calorie intake. Then 45% of those calories from carbs would be 170. And here you've got 2,000 calories. 45% of those calories from carbs would be 225. And so here's some examples of things that you could have that would fit within those budgets. So breakfast here could be a couple slices of whole grain bread. Again, each of those is about one carb choice. Topping it with some avocado, which is low carb, and a fried egg for the protein. Then your snack may be a quarter cup of nuts, an apple. Apple would be your main carbohydrate source. Nuts have a little bit, but not much. And then lunch may be something like a burrito bowl, skipping the tortilla and having like a half a cup of beans, a quarter cup of cooked rice, some veggies, some chicken. Snack may be string cheese plus one of your carb choices here. Dinner may be palm size 3 ounces of salmon plus a half a cup of some type of whole grain such as quinoa and a cup of broccoli. And then you may have an evening snack if you're hungry of something like a plain Greek yogurt or a low sugar yogurt. And then over here, 2,000 calories, you get a little bit more. Here you could do the tortilla or the wrap, which tends to be pretty high in carbs, but you're doing it with some protein with a couple eggs, and you're minimizing the other added carbs, a quarter cup of black beans and some small avocado, half a small avocado. Same sort of thing for lunch. Dinner, larger portions. You can do the half a cup of beans and maybe up to half a cup of brown rice and a little bit more chicken to make it more filling. Snack may be the yogurt and some berries. And that may be 2 carb choices. Reading the labels on the yogurts would be helpful too because they vary quite a bit in the carbohydrate content. And then dinner, same sort of thing, but a little bit larger portions on this higher calorie target. 4 ounces of salmon, maybe 3/4 of a cup of the whole grain, and then bumping up the broccoli. Because if we're reducing the whole grains, if you're used to having a cup and a half of rice or pasta, and we're taking that down to 3/4 of a cup, you're really going to have to add some volume of food to that plate. And so bumping up those low starch vegetables is going to be the most helpful. And maybe even a little bit more protein depending on how much you start with. And here you still have room for a snack. An apple and peanut butter. Apple's going to be 1 carb choice, and you'll get a tiny bit of carbs from the peanut butter. So again, if you're using one of the apps, it's going to give you more accurate numbers in terms of giving you the total grams. If you're going out to eat or you're going to a friend's house, you can eyeball it using those slides that break down those 3 main sources of carbohydrate, the fruits, the starches, and the starchy vegetables, and go by each of those bullet points is 1 carb choice, and just tell yourself, okay, I have 2 carb choices, or I have 3 or 4 carb choices per meal. What am I going to choose? So now we'll move on to talking about sugar, which again is a type of carbohydrate. So sugar is the basic building blocks of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates break down and turn into sugars into your bloodstream to get absorbed. So there's sucrose, which is usually like the table sugar. There's glucose and fructose, which is found in fruits, veggies, honey. There's lactose, which is going to be in milk products, and maltose, which is going to be in malted drinks, malted beverages like beers. So where does sugar come from? There'll be natural sugars, added sugars. Here it gives you a list of all the different names of sugar. So you may see any of these on a food label if you are looking at the list of ingredients. These are different ways to add sugar. It could be fructose. It could be corn syrup. It could be corn syrup solids, high fructose corn syrup. It could be maple syrup. You're also going to find sugar from fruit and dried fruit. It's going to be more concentrated in the dry fruit, just because if you think of 10 raisins versus 10 grapes, the volume is going to be much smaller. How much you're actually eating is going to feel like a lot less with the raisins. It's going to be more concentrated in the sugar. Juices, because those are made of fruits, there's going to be sugar in those. Jam, fruit spreads, honey, and maple syrup. Yes, those are sources of sugar. Dairy products are sources of sugar, the lactose, and then, as you saw over here, the various names of added sugars. So a good visual to keep in mind is that 4 grams of sugar is equivalent to 1 teaspoon. This way, when you're reading food labels, it makes more sense. If you see the number of grams of sugar, you can visualize what that looks like. Otherwise, you see the number of grams of the sugar, it doesn't really mean much. So this is a good visual if you start reading food labels to think of, okay, well, how many teaspoons of sugar is that? So if you were going to guess how much sugar is in a 12-ounce Coke, what would be your guess? How many grams of sugar or how many teaspoons of sugar? So this is going to be 39 grams of sugar, which, if we turn that into teaspoons, 4 grams of sugar is a teaspoon, is going to be about 10 teaspoons of sugar. So if you really want to shock yourself, measure out 10 teaspoons of sugar and put it in a cup and imagine drinking that. And then how much sugar is in a 16-ounce Starbucks mocha frappuccino? A lot of times people say, I'm just going to grab a coffee. Well, their coffee is mostly sugar. So what would be the guess on something like this? So this will contain 61 grams of sugar, which is going to be 15 teaspoons of sugar. So quite a lot of sugar. So now let's look at what the recommendations are, so you have something to compare that to. So for women, the recommendation is 6 teaspoons or less per day of added sugar. And for men, it's 9 teaspoons or less per day of added sugar. And I emphasize the added sugar because they have started adding that to food labels. And we'll take a look at that in a minute here, where it specifies how much sugar is in the product and how much of that total sugar is added versus natural. Natural sugar would be like your fruits. Added sugar would be like your white sugar or your corn syrup. So for women, that 6 teaspoons is equivalent to 24 grams. And for men, that 9 teaspoons is equivalent to 36 grams. So if you go back to the example of the 12-ounce Coke, you're already over your limit for added sugar for the day just from one Coke. And this is recommendations from the American Heart Association. So where's the sugar? So this is what I was explaining. If you look at the food label and you scroll down to total carbohydrate, again, within that total carbohydrate is going to be your fiber and your sugars. So 25 grams total sugar, which includes 23 grams of added sugar. And here we can see, if we go to the ingredients, that added sugar is corn syrup, invert sugar, more corn syrup, fructose syrup. So that's where you're getting the added sugars from. If it just said total sugars and included 0 grams added sugar, I would expect to see that likely from fruit or fruit juice. So when we're reading labels, here you can see Looking at the serving size and looking at the added sugars will be helpful information. Here's an example with ketchup. 1 tablespoon of ketchup is going to be 4 grams of added sugar. And you can compare that to other brands, and you can find some brands out there that have 1 gram of added sugar or no grams of added sugar. But it's just something to be aware of, that these added sugars are not necessarily from coffee drinks or Cokes or pastries or cookies. It can be in everyday foods that you consume, and they're adding up really, really quickly. So 1 tablespoon, if you're going to throw in 2 tablespoons of ketchup on whatever food you're having for dinner, on top of your meatloaf or with your French fries or whatever it might be, that can add up in the sugar department pretty quickly. So find some alternatives. Skippy peanut butter, some of the Jif peanut butters, those are other ones that can be high in sugar. So here's an example. 2 tablespoons of this is 3 grams of sugar, which it doesn't sound like it's high, but if it's something that you have every day and you can find an alternative that has 0 grams of sugar, that's going to be a better option. And you can see in the ingredient list, roasted peanuts, second ingredient sugar, then you've got hydrogenated oils and all this other stuff. And you can find different peanut butters that the ingredient list is just going to be peanuts and maybe some salt. So it wouldn't have any grams of sugar in it. And then another option here, another example would be this teriyaki sauce. So 1 tablespoon of this teriyaki sauce is 3 grams of sugar. So if you're doing something like if you're ordering out like chicken teriyaki and you think, okay, the only place my carbohydrates is coming from is the rice, well, you're wrong, because that teriyaki sauce contains sugar, which counts again as a carbohydrate. So every tablespoon, you've got 3 grams of sugar. So again, that's going to add up pretty quick. So monitor your portions of these types of sauces. And for a lot of these, you can find alternatives that are lower in sugar. It's just first being aware that the sugar's in there and then finding an alternative. Here's another example. So here for this product, this is actually barbecue sauce. We've got 2 tablespoons is equivalent to or contains 16 grams of added sugar. So 2 tablespoons contains 4 teaspoons of added sugar. And you can see in the ingredient list that's coming mostly from high fructose corn syrup, because that's the first ingredient. The ingredients are listed by weight. So whatever weighs the most is going to be listed first. And that usually means it's the most amount of that product in the food. Here is another barbecue sauce, same portion, 2 tablespoons. And this one includes 4 grams of added sugar. So you're saving 12 grams of added sugar by choosing an alternative product. And you can see in the ingredient list, tomato puree is actually the first ingredient. There's sugar in here, but it's third on the list. So I don't know if anybody has any guesses about what type of barbecue sauce this is. This first one is Sweet Baby Ray's, and the second one is Stubbs. And you can find both of these at a lot of grocery stores. And you may choose one because you're used to seeing that one or because of the price. And now that you know how much added sugar, start to be choosier, start to read food labels so that you can choose the best option for your health, for the weight loss. Here's another one comparing examples. Elenos is a common yogurt brand in our area. And here we've got a 5-ounce serving includes 17 grams of added sugar. Versus another brand, Siggy's, we've got 1 container, it's about the same size, is 9 grams of total sugar. So this one here is not listing how much is natural and how much is added, but we can look at this total sugar, 9 grams, compared to this total sugar, which is 24 grams, and that's a big difference. So I'd even be better off getting the Siggy's yogurt, adding a teaspoon of honey to it, and it's still going to be lower than this option. If you did go for one of like the plain options, then that would help significantly reduce the sugar intake. And usually whatever sugar you add to a plain yogurt is going to be much less than what they add to a flavored yogurt, what the manufacturer adds to a flavored yogurt. And here you can look at the ingredients and see where the sugar is coming from. Cane sugar, honey. The lemon curd puree also contains cane sugar. So a lot of people talk about being addicted to sugar. Well, you can see how the sugar shows up just in our everyday food products, which kind of drives that addiction as well. So trying to get it out of your everyday food products is going to be helpful. This is kind of how the cycle goes. You eat the sugar, you like it, you crave it. It does have addictive properties to it. The blood sugar levels, your blood sugar levels spike, and that releases dopamine from the brain, which can signal sort of like an addiction to get back to more and more dopamine being released. We also start to produce insulin, which insulin's job is to take sugar out of the bloodstream. If there's a whole bunch of sugar at one time, we can overproduce that insulin, and then that leads to a significant drop in our blood sugar levels, which can make people feel a little bit lightheaded, dizzy, or sometimes just poor mood or super hungry or more cravings. So when that blood sugar falls rapidly, then those high insulin levels can cause a lot of fat storage because they're bringing that sugar out of the bloodstream as rapidly as possible. And then our body craves that lost sugar high, and those cravings lead to increased appetite. And then again, repeating this cycle because of that. So what can we do about it? Some ideas for breaking the sugar cycle. Really trying to eat as many healthy whole foods. Whole foods meaning things that aren't coming out of a bag or a package, not processed. Because these are going to ensure you've got plenty of intake of vitamins and minerals. If we're low in our intake of vitamins and minerals, we tend to crave things like sugar. Try not to go more than 4 or 5 hours without eating. If you've spent 6 hours since you last ate and somebody walks by with chocolate chip cookies, you are going to be a lot more likely to give in than if you had something to eat a couple hours prior. Find ways to manage emotions that don't involve food. So a lot of times sugar cravings can be related to certain emotional triggers, stress eating, or sadness or anger. So it's great if you have a list of things to do, like start making a list that you can reference when you are having strong emotions. It's hard to do it at the time that you have the strong emotions. So if you can create a list of things to do besides eat when you're feeling more in a neutral mood, then it'll be easier to go to that list and say, okay, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to talk to a friend, or whatever ideas you come up with. And we talk about the protein piece in the protein class, but including enough protein throughout the day is hugely beneficial for people that have strong sugar cravings. Often it's because they're not getting enough protein. And then try to limit your overall sweet foods because your taste buds are going to get used to wanting everything sweet, sweet, sweet. So again, trying to avoid the added sugars in as many of the products like the ketchup and the sauces that you have at home. Some people like to do artificial sweeteners in place of sugars. That's okay in small amounts, but sometimes it can drive up that desire for sweet, sweet, sweet because you're starting to include your beverages being sweet as well. So if you want to alter your taste buds, I'd recommend cutting back on the artificial sweeteners as well. So now we're going to set goals and intention. So reference the weekly goals handout, which is provided, and we'll go over that in a second here. So set goals for the first week. Then you're going to assess your progress, identify barriers, how to overcome, and then modify the goals for the next week. And keep repeating it until you feel you've met your needs. I'll show you what that looks like. So this is your weekly goal setting handout, and here's some examples using the information from today on carbohydrates and sugars. So all that information is great information, but it doesn't do much if you're not actually putting it into action. So this is where the action piece comes in. So the homework for you is then to print out the goals worksheet and go through and complete it as soon as you can after going through this slideshow, because that's what's going to be really beneficial, is putting this into action and how you want to put it into action. So here's some examples using that information. So with goal number 1, I may say I'm going to commit to reducing the sugar added to my coffee by limiting it to 1 teaspoon for 6 days a week. So you want to be as specific as possible so you can actually visualize what you're going to do. And then think of what are possible barriers to making that happen, or what are some strategies to make it more likely to happen. So a barrier may be, okay, well, if I only do 1 teaspoon of sugar, I am not going to like the taste of my coffee. Okay, well then in that case, maybe my idea will be to make a smaller cup of coffee. So the ratio is the same, the amount of sugar to coffee, but it's a smaller portion. And then every day that I actually do that in the next week, I would go here and I would either write an X or a smiley face or a gold star, whatever is going to make you happy so you can track for the week. Goal number 2, an example may be I will decrease my portions of pasta, rice, or grains or potatoes at dinner to 1 cup. And then I would be sure to be doing that 5 days a week. What are possible barriers and strategies? Well, I'm going to measure out my portions before placing the food on my plate to make sure that it is only 1 cup. Because how are you really going to know unless you measure it out? And then I may think of a possible barrier. Could be if my spouse is actually dishing my food on the plate, then I'll have to ask my spouse to measure out the portions before filling my plate, or maybe ask to portion out my own food. And then I would go through, this would be goal number 2. My goal is to get that done 5 days a week. Mark off those 5 days that I hit. And this is a way to visually track your progress, which is really helpful. A lot of times we think we're doing something, but when we look at the reality of it, we may not actually be doing it as often as we think we are. So this will be great to keep somewhere that you see often as a reminder, like these are the first couple goals that I'm working on for the week or for the next 2 or 3 weeks. So print it out, put it somewhere that you'll see on the fridge, bathroom counter, whatever's easiest. And this will really help to implement some of those things we discussed today about carbohydrates and limiting sweets. So hopefully I will see you in one of the next PowerPoints.